everyone to day 2 of summer school. My name is Eleanor. I'm one of the co-directors of this year's summer school alongside Anya, and I'm also the director of the Centre for Disability Law and Policy here. Okay, so it's my pleasure to step into the very impressive shoes of Rosemary Kayess, who was to be our chair this morning, but is unfortunately not available at the moment, and to chair this morning's discussion, where we're going to talk about the intersections of disability and other identities, so children, gender, and LGBTQI communities, in all of the areas that we're focusing on this year at summer school, so in climate change, in times of crisis, including public health crisis, and also, of course, in times of conflict. I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker for the panel today, Kirstin Lange, who works with UNICEF as a program specialist on disability inclusive humanitarian action. Kirstin is also the co-chair of the reference group on inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action. And her full bio is in the programme, and I would encourage you to take a look at it. But for now, I'm going to invite Kirstin to come to the podium to share her experience with us. Thanks, Kirstin.
Okay, good morning, everybody. As mentioned, my name is Kirstin. I work with UNICEF as Program Specialist on Disability Inclusive Humanitarian Action. Really happy to be here with you today, so thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm looking forward to the discussion throughout the day. I'm going to be speaking today about how age and disability intersect to create marginalisation of children with disabilities in emergencies, and touch on what are some of the actions that we can be considering as part of preparedness for emergencies. So to begin, I wanted to speak firstly about exclusion from education and how that looks in emergencies for children with disabilities. So most of us here in the room, I think, are very familiar with exclusion of children with disabilities from education globally. We know, for example, that at upper secondary level, 35% of children with more than one functional impairment are not in school. Those numbers are even further increased if we look, for example, at children with psychosocial disabilities. We also know that enrolment of refugee children in secondary education is 2/3 lower than for other children. So taking those two together, if we consider exclusion of children with disabilities impacted by humanitarian emergencies, we can expect that those levels of exclusion are particularly high. So why is this? We're all, I think, fairly familiar with the factors that create exclusion of children with disabilities, the different levels of discrimination. In emergencies, many of those factors are even further exacerbated. So, for example, we often see, both in conflict and in natural hazards, and more recently in a public health emergency, that schools are either destroyed or closed. In armed conflict, for example, schools can be closed as they're being used to house internally displaced persons, for example. In the context of school closures, we may have temporary learning spaces set up or distance learning, remote learning put in place. However, they're very rarely accessible to children with disabilities. We also see that in emergencies, both conflict and natural hazards, there's the creation of new physical obstacles for children to be able to access school. And those physical obstacles are even more exacerbated for children with disabilities, as you can imagine. We also see, particularly in displacement contexts, that children may be displaced far from service centres and far from learning facilities, which again create those additional obstacles. And there's often a lack of accessible transport. We also see that in emergencies, we often have particularly large class sizes, which create particular challenges in terms of inclusive education. Those large class sizes can be due to teachers fleeing, not having enough teachers around. It can also be due, for example, in displacement contexts, where you have an influx of refugees or IDPs to a particular area. And as a result, you have, for example, double shifting in schools. Now, also for refugees particularly, we see language barriers if children are displaced across borders or even within borders in some settings, as well as administrative obstacles. There may be a strong inclusive education system in a country. However, refugees in that country may not have access because of their legal status. Now, those that exclusion from education, it's a denial of rights in and of itself. However, in emergencies, it also creates further aspects of exclusion. So, for example, in emergencies, a lot of different forms of humanitarian assistance are delivered through schools. So children who are not in schools also miss out on those forms of assistance. So, for example, preparedness actions, teaching children how to respond in the case of an emergency. They're often implemented through schools, so children with disabilities will miss out. In the same way, they're likely to miss out on, for example, the safe spaces that schools provide, school feeding, nutrition screening, psychosocial support, all of these forms of humanitarian assistance that are delivered through schools. So that's education. I'd like to now also speak a bit about violence, exploitation and abuse, because we know that this is one of the key challenges that are faced by children with disabilities specifically. We know that children with disabilities are 4 to 6 times as likely as other children to experience violence and abuse. And for girls with disabilities, they're nearly 3 times more likely to experience sexual violence when compared to girls without disabilities. Now, these are global figures. So in a humanitarian emergency, these are even further magnified. And some of the factors that increase that violence, exploitation and abuse in emergencies is that children, alongside adults, can often be left behind when communities flee, left behind by their families and communities. We're also increasingly seeing examples of targeted violence against persons with disabilities in emergencies. So, for example, Human Rights Watch documented some examples of this in the Central African Republic a few years ago. We also see that when children with disabilities are separated from their supportive networks, whether that be their peer networks, their family networks, their community networks, they're really placed at much heightened risk of violence, exploitation and abuse. And in an emergency, particularly where there is displacement, there's a breakdown in those community support networks. We also see that the service, and particularly the education disruptions in emergencies, the impacts they have in terms of increasing this risk of violence, exploitation and abuse. Children will no longer have access, for example, to child protection actors. Families will be placed under increased stress where there are those service disruptions. So on that last point, we also see that in emergencies, households are under increased stress. They're under increased psychosocial stress. They also face additional practical pressures, such as going out to access assistance, going out to find livelihoods opportunities. And all of these factors, again, increase that risk of abuse and exploitation of children with disabilities. And the final point on this is on crossing borders. So this is one of the risks, for example, that we have concerns about in the situation of Ukraine, where we have children in institutions being evacuated across borders. We know that children, and children with disabilities in particular, if they're unaccompanied, their risks are multiplied if they're crossing those borders, international borders unaccompanied. So on that point, I also wanted to touch for a few moments on institutionalization as a particular form of human rights abuse faced by children with disabilities globally. So globally, it's estimated that 1 in 3 children in institutions is a child with disabilities. So here again, we're seeing that intersection between disability and age. We know that in institutions, they're often characterised by poor living conditions and extremely high rates of violence and abuse, such as forced medication, etc. Now, just as an indication of this, one very disturbing statistic is that the mortality rate for children with disabilities in institutional care is 100 times higher than for other children. So these statistics are already particularly grim. But what we see is that in emergencies, the type of risks that children with disabilities in institutions face, again, are multiplied even further. So in institutions, we often see that staff will flee together with the broader community. So where you have staff fleeing, it leaves children in those institutions without even the most basic of care. And we've seen this in a few different settings. We also see that institutions, and children in institutions in particular, are often invisible to humanitarian actors. So they're often not included in preparedness planning. They may not be included in evacuations. They're often not included in humanitarian assistance. They remain very much hidden and at very high risk. Linked to this point, children in institutions, including children with disabilities, they also lack access to information. Again, information about preparedness will often not reach children in institutions. Information about the emergency more broadly is often not something that children in institutions have access to. And again, we're seeing this, I'm mentioning Ukraine a few times because it is something that's currently very, very much in the public domain. We're speaking about this a lot and it's a huge concern. But also in the case of Ukraine, for example, we again have concerns for trafficking of children in institutions, particularly where they're crossing borders in an emergency. Now, I wanted to speak briefly about access to assistive technology and supports. But I want to speak about access to assistive technology as one example of how children with disabilities' access to services is impacted in an emergency. So many of the points that I'll raise in relation to assistive technology will also apply to other types of services. Now, the reason I'm focusing on assistive technology is firstly that it is an enabler to accessing rights. Access to assistive technology enables access to information. It enables access to education, participation in the community. I'm also focusing on this one because if we're talking about children, children have additional needs for AT. Their growing bodies require adaptation of AT, replacement of AT, and in emergencies, this poses a particular challenge. So some of the barriers that we see, specifically in humanitarian contexts around access to AT, are firstly the pressure on health systems, or the pressure on all systems that support the delivery of AT. So for example, we see an exodus of health professionals or AT professionals. In displacement contexts, we see that service systems are under pressure where large populations are moving into an area. Budgets may be diverted to addressing the immediate impacts of the crisis, and AT may be one of the first areas where there's budget cuts. We also often see in emergencies that there's very much a focus on impairments acquired during the crisis. However, we know that most AT needs are actually predate the crisis, and the extent to which they have been addressed very much vary. So that's another key challenge. We also see, for example, administrative obstacles for refugees. Again, similar to the point on education, there may be a strong AT system in the country where they're being hosted. Refugees may not have access due to their legal status as non-citizens. We also know that AT is relatively high cost, so difficult to scale up in an emergency. In this picture, there is a picture of a young boy in a wheelchair. And what you notice from this picture is that this wheelchair is not suitable to his individual needs, and that's something that we very commonly see in emergencies. Often in emergencies, there's a reliance on large-scale donations, which are not adapted either to the context or to the individual needs. And the final challenge to highlight around AT is also a lack of coordination. So humanitarian emergencies don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in a national context with existing national systems and service providers. But often we don't see coordination between humanitarian actors, the international humanitarian response, and the national system. And that really creates those gaps in access. So all of those points specific to AT, I think, can also be applied to other types of services. Now, the final barrier, the final challenge to highlight before I'll touch very briefly on what can be done is around barriers to participation. So where we're talking about participation, we very clearly see age and disability intersect to create exclusion for children with disabilities. So children are excluded on the basis of both age and disability. So what we see, for example, is that information and communication, such as complaints and feedback mechanisms, information about sexual exploitation and abuse etc. They're not inclusive of children. They're not produced in child-friendly formats. Where they are in child-friendly formats, they're often not accessible. We also see that mechanisms for consultation in the same way. They exclude persons with disabilities. They're not accessible. And they exclude children at the same time. So I wanted to, I think I have about 5 minutes left, so I wanted to make sure I could touch a little bit on what can be done, and particularly what are some of the things that you can think about factoring in at the preparedness stage. I do have a few videos, but I will share them with you in the pack that gets sent out afterwards, just to save time during this presentation. So the first example I wanted to share with you is around consultation. And the video that I'll share with you, it's fully accessible. It shows consultation with children with disabilities in Zatari camp in Jordan around construction of wash facilities, water sanitation and hygiene. So it shows how the wash engineers were speaking with each individual child with a disability and asking, how can we make this service in your home more accessible? Very simple example, but something that I think is often forgotten in humanitarian emergencies. The need to be both child-friendly and accessible in those consultation mechanisms. The next example I'll share with you, I am going to try to show a 1-minute video. And this is an example of inclusive information and communication, specifically in the context of mine risk education. So this is an example of mine risk education for children who are deaf in Yemen. I'm not sure we have volume, but we do have captions, so hopefully I can speak through it in just a moment. We don't have captions. Okay, I'll stop the video just because I haven't managed to have it with captions and sound, so I will talk through it and share it with you afterwards in an accessible format. So basically, this was a program in Yemen where UNICEF was delivering mine risk education to children. They found children with hearing impairments were excluded. So they developed specific materials in sign language and actually trained the children with disabilities themselves to then become actors in mine risk education and deliver this training to other children in the community. So the other example I have is around fostering peer networks. What I have here is a video of, again, in Zatari refugee camp in Jordan, of 2 young boys, about 12 years old, who became friends, a boy with and without a disability. And what this highlights is really the importance of fostering those peer networks between children with and without disabilities. It's important in terms of developing self-esteem in children, developing those protective networks, supporting their inclusion. It's, again, very simple concept, but something that is often forgotten. There's often a very strong focus on medicalised approaches rather than these very, very basic social approaches. So the video shows the importance of friendships between children with and without disabilities. And the picture on the screen is of an inclusive playground in Zatari refugee camp in Jordan, which is fully accessible for children with different types of disabilities and fosters that play between all children. And we found that it had really a strong impact on children with disabilities in that setting. Another example I'd like to share is of inclusive humanitarian cash. So this is from Syria. Cash is increasingly becoming a preferred modality of assistance in humanitarian action. It very much has the potential to increase choice, increase dignity. But for persons with disabilities, it can also create additional barriers if not planned well. So what UNICEF did in Syria is it had a cash distribution program, which was combined with child protection assistance. So combined with mine risk education, psychosocial support, the cash assistance was specifically planned with inclusion at its core. And what we found was that it resulted in an increased expenditure on health and education by households with children with disabilities who were participating. Now, I believe the final The final example is, again, a very simple concept, and this relates to physical accessibility. So the image I have on the screen here, and there is an accompanying video as well, is from Cox's Bazar, which is the Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh, and it's of a device, a very simple device that can go across the top of a squatting plate in a latrine. So basically the latrines that we normally have in refugee camps, they're very difficult for many people with disabilities to use. So this was a very simple, very low cost device that can make latrines much more usable, not only for persons with disabilities, but for many other people. And the video shows the impact that this had on many people's lives, particularly children, including enabling them to access education, sometimes for the first time. So very simple device, very low cost, that can make a big difference. And the point around preparedness that I'd like to make in this is an important part of preparedness is stockpiling. So thinking about, is assistive technology a part of those stockpiling efforts? Are simple solutions such as this a part of those stockpiling efforts? So just a very practical, very simple, low cost example of a solution. I will stop there. I'll be sharing these videos and a few other resources with you. And thank you so much. Very much looking forward to the discussion this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirstin. That was really fascinating, and I think it's so great to have practical examples like that to share. I know a lot of our Q&A session yesterday was people looking for those really practical and often low-cost examples as well. So it's great to see that that's part of your presentation and resources that you're going to share with everyone from this week onwards. So I'm pleased now to introduce our next speaker, Pratima Gurung. Pratima is an active academic activist from Nepal who has worked on women, Indigenous peoples, disability rights, and has been remarkable in bridging multiple marginalised identities with an intersectional lens. So she is the perfect speaker for this morning's panel. And we have asked her to focus specifically on the intersection between disability and gender, which I know is at the core of your work, Pratima. So delighted to welcome you to the panel.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for providing me this opportunity. I'm very humbled to be in this rich discussion to speak on intersection of disability, age, gender, and sex in the title of Disability in Age of Conflict, Crisis, and Climate Change. I will share some of the examples from the ground experience and the realities related with the groups with multiple identities in the conflict, crisis, and climate change, focusing from a different lens and also focusing from the global south. I represent Indigenous persons with disabilities global network, and when it comes to the word like intersectionality, the terminology has really been a buzzword at the global level, both in academia and across the movement, disability movement and other marginalized movements like the feminist, disability, racial and other movements in the recent days. And many efforts have been initiated at this present moment to address the different kinds of experiences faced by multiple groups and intersecting identities. If you look at the normative framework, some of the reports that we heard yesterday from Yolanda, some of the reports that clearly outlines about the intersections and multiple marginalized groups like the Human Rights Council report, the Special Rapporteur's report, the CRPD article 11, the CEDAW, the Convention on the Rights of Discrimination Against Women, the UN Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People, the Convention on the Biodiversity, and if you look at the general comments of the CRPD 5, 7, and other general comments, including the concluding observations that has been provided to different member states, including Nepal, that clearly outlines about these discussions. And we are recently now in the 7th Global Disaster Risk Reduction framework, and we have the Sendai framework, which clearly outlines about these intersections and person with disabilities issues in the midterm report. We also have various research and studies and articles that has been initiated at the global level and even in academia. We hear and we have been participating in different discussions at the global level, conducting different side events done by organizations of people with disabilities. By saying this, having said all this, I would say that we still lack those discussions happening at the local and national level, because the word intersections itself is a very new discourse to most of the organization of people with disabilities, the government, and other multi-stakeholders. The existing framework structures, including the laws, policies, and the normative framework at the national level, is still in a one single linear siloed approach, where one characteristics or one identity like women or people with disabilities from different impairment groups are being discussed. People with disabilities are not discussed within a heterogeneous or multiple identity groups. The word intersectionality and its scope with various multiple identities with the characteristics such as race, age, disability, indigeneity, migration status, and sexual orientations. These are not debated in the normal setting and during the conflict, crisis, and climate change debate, or in the humanitarian emergencies. This is how we realize that there is always a blanket approach to address the needs and priorities of the marginalized groups during the humanitarian emergencies, crisis, and conflict. The experience reflects that the needs and priorities and the experience of multiple identity groups in the intersections of gender, age, disability, race, and sexual orientation and identities are unique and are different. We are subjected to a multiple and complex, unique wave of discrimination. And this is where we face the multiple layers of exclusion, isolation, violence, and are at risk. When the situation is further connected with crisis and conflict and the emerging climate change debate, the multiple identities, issues, and the conditions are mostly unsafe. We receive unfair distributions, lack of information, access to services, and also our voices are most often unheard, undocumented, undebated, and the narratives are framed from, again, a single linear lens. The single dominant identity and the worldview with the set of power. The dominant worldview becomes the truth and the reality, and most research and studies and the findings and the normative frameworks are framed in that certain standards. We still find inequality, marginalizations, and exclusion on the ground, and that is why we are framing our own narratives looking at the intersections of gender, disability, indigeneity, and other identities, generating evidences from the ground, and also setting our own narratives from the margin. We experience, even at the global level, the intersections of disability and gender has been quite debated, but when it comes to indigeneity, we often found this debate has been again excluded. We are able to bring the collective and individual worldview. And when it comes to indigenous identities, these are very much crucial when it comes to climate justice intervention. Today, we are talking about and discussing about the climate change and the crisis and the conflict that has impacted our daily lives and realities. I will be sharing some of the experience shared by indigenous women and girls with disabilities and how they are subjected to violence that are perpetrated against by the state and non-state actors in a very systematic way. Indigenous people with disabilities comprising of 54 million and indigenous women and girls with disabilities comprise of 28 million all around the globe. Additionally and specifically are affected uniquely by the climate change, environmental degradations like floods, droughts, landslide, mountains, glaciers are melting every day. The industrial scale agriculture and extractive industries and the projects, and we face an elevated risk of health problem, including reproductive health problems and high infant mortality rates. associated with the environmental contaminations and degradations that has led our life, and traditional and spiritual way of life is been lost. Today, our cultural identity and livelihood is in question. We are pulling into the crisis of impoverishment, exposure to gender-based violence, and the prevalence rate of disability and vulnerability is increasing day by day. Our traditional lifestyles of food production and consumption from the forest, mountains, and land has been forcibly denied by the state policies and rules and systems. The traditional customary practices of the seed, food, and productive lands have become barren due to the excessive pesticides. And today, as a person with disabilities and women with disabilities, we are facing hunger, starvation, lack of wash, nutrition, food, housing, and forced internal migration, and poverty is higher among indigenous people and people with disabilities. The study shows that only 1.1% indigenous people with disabilities have access to land, forest, and natural resources. And this is how we are losing our identity, our value, our system of the collective world. And if you look at the entire Nepal, where I belong, Nepal ranks in the 4th position according to the global climate risks. In relating with the armed conflict, we have also our own experience. The expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples have clearly outlined that indigenous women and girls have been displaced, mostly related from their land territories or from the natural resources. And this is where the vulnerability to gender-based violence is in very increasing form. The violence manifests itself in a multiple way through the ethnic conflict, forceful deprivations, sexual violence, and trafficking, criminality, labor exploitations, and the situation of vulnerability in the result of poverty. When it comes to the crisis like pandemic, the study shows that 91.13% experienced social and economic impact during the COVID pandemic. 84% faced different difficulties with the lockdown of the pandemic, and 80.51% were adversely affected by the COVID pandemic. They also had the serious psychological stress, anxiety, and fear during the pandemic. 72.8% indigenous people with disabilities and their families lost their livelihood. These are some of the statistics that I would like to share. But one of the things that I would like to highlight about is the structural, the historical, the indirect discriminations that we face as women with disabilities and indigenous women with disabilities have never been documented in the way that we have experienced. We also realize that 94.29% indigenous women and girls with disabilities are subjected to more violence than their counterparts without disabilities. 76.90% indigenous women and girls have experienced and observed gender-based violence, mostly in the multiple forms during the pandemic. So this clearly outlines that people with disabilities and indigenous people with disabilities and women with disabilities face attitudinal, structural, psychosocial, institutional, multiple layer identities and barriers during the humanitarian risks and emergencies. The socio-economic impact and the cultural impact and the reflection of the ground reality in the intersections of gender, disability, and other identities varies from one group to another group in a unique form. We have been working on this area since the COP 2015 in the Paris, where we were able to document some of the words and terminologies like person with disabilities and indigenous people, with having negotiation with different member states and stakeholders. We have been working with after the 2015 earthquake that happened in Nepal. We still find that the disasters and the climate change discourse is still a siloed approach. And this is where we feel that the intersections lens is very much required from the grassroots, from the national, regional, and global level. We are trying to connect the dots of the disasters and climate change gap and recommending our government and other stakeholders to take a concrete, tangible actions by ensuring an inclusive world, which requires a long-term preparedness and mass awareness backed by the multi-pronged approach. And this is where we have been exemplifying some of the examples during the pandemic and in the humanitarian emergencies, like the accessible formats and measures related with informations to ensure the different layers of emergencies responders and are they are sensitized and been properly informed with the free, prior, and informed consent of persons with disabilities with different types of impairment. Today, we are also claiming that diversity within the disability, intersectionality, accessibility, and inclusion is a preconditions to address the climate change justice. We realize that the multi-stakeholder engagement with the government, with the collective team effort, is creating an enabling space and resilient environment for all, so that we can engage throughout the entire process as the active contributors with their meaningful participation, which is fundamental at all levels. The climate change mitigations, resilient capacity, including our traditional knowledge system of indigenous people, should be respected and promoted. When it comes to persons with disabilities, they have their own contributions and knowledge about what accessibility and inclusion means. And this is where this knowledge has to be documented. And we know that people with disabilities should be on the table when the decisions are made. But by building the capacity to discuss on those issues that is impacting on our daily lives and realities are very much crucial. We believe that our participation is crucial at the all levels when we realize that the national determined contributions and are being designed and framed at the national level and at the UNFCCC framework when the disability constituency are made and the priorities and agendas are set for vulnerable groups. So this is where the people with disabilities can play a crucial role. We are recommending our states and concerned stakeholders to take a system-wide action approach to transform the working, to reform some of the discriminatory behaviors that happens in the crisis, conflict, and in the humanitarian emergencies by the mobilizations of organizations of people with disabilities. Engaging in the disaster risk reduction process is key for us. When the loss and damage debate is happening around at the global level, we are also debating about the finance and the investment on the groups to ensure the safe, accessible, and enabling environment to implement those commitments into action at the local level. All the sectors of the government, including the social security, health, employment, support system, and other relevant stakeholders, should be mainstreamed. Conflict, crisis, disaster risk reductions, marginalized groups' priorities, and their response and recovery plan from an intersectional lens is very much crucial. The most marginalized identities indicators in line with the SDG of leaving no one behind should be framed. And that is why we need to undertake specific measures towards reducing vulnerabilities on them for the future disasters and emergency crises. The governments and the member states and the UN agencies and academia with the political will and the commitment is very much vital to build trust, share communications, and respect for all persons with disabilities. We believe that our unheard, untold, undocumented stories of the intersections of gender, disability, indigeneity, and other sexual identities within the climate justice debate need to be debated, documented with research, studies, and plans, with the evidence in different labels. People with disabilities have to be championed on their issues, and they need to be on the table when decisions are made on the impacts affecting to our lives by ensuring that no one is left behind. I will just stop here my presentations, and I look forward having more rich conversations with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pratima. It was really stirring and important to hear that focus on the resilience and the problem-solving skills that disabled people naturally have and can be drawn upon by others that are working on these issues in the times of emergency, in times of crisis, conflict, and climate change as well. And especially important to bring that Indigenous perspective as well around traditional ways of life and how disabled people are culturally understood and valued within their communities as part of all the solutions to these world-changing events that we're talking about.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Eleanor, for introducing me, and hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which LGBTQI people with disabilities often live in crisis and conflict from society and in their own bodies. This also includes disabled people from other intersectionalities and marginalizations, specifically disabled people who are young, trans, poor, lower caste, sex workers, HIV positive, dark-skinned, indigenous, migrant, or living in the global south. So some of the big things I have realized in my work is that people have not heard a lot about the history of disability or queer rights movements in South Asia. Our histories are often erased and we are still stuck in definitions and terminologies. The current Indian government has termed people with disabilities as Divyang, which literally means the divine body. This shows that we are still stuck in the medical and charity model of disability, going against the UN Conventions for Rights of Persons with Disability. And it is the same with the recent Transgender Act of 2019 that the Indian government introduced, which medicalizes our bodies and our identities even more further. In India, we still have to acquire an official document known as the Disability Certificate that medically proves us as disabled. The bureaucratic government, officials, doctors, and professionals who issue these disability certificates to us harass us constantly, over-scrutinize our bodies, and don't believe us. A lot of people in my community who are hard of hearing or have vision impairment are told by the doctors that they are lying to receive disability benefits. This is similar to the invasive processes that trans people have to go through to prove they are actually trans, and those who want to medically transition their gender have to pass through psychiatric examinations. So I want to talk about bodily autonomy, which basically means being able to make our own decisions about our bodies. For example, what I want to eat, what career path I want to follow, where I want to go, whenever I want, etc. Specifically, I want to talk about bodily autonomy in relation to the Britney Spears legal case against her conservatorship, also known as a guardianship. So, by a show of hands, how many of you know who Britney Spears is? And online, there is a poll. So, your people who are attending online can answer the poll. Yeah, I see almost more than half. Yeah, more than half of the people know who Britney Spears is. And then another question I have for all of you. How many of you know what is a guardianship? Yeah, again, more than half. Yeah. Yeah, I hope people online have been able to answer.
I don't think so, but it's okay. Keep going.
Okay. So Britney Spears is a popular American singer and dancer, often referred to as the Princess of Pop in the United States. And guardianship is a legal procedure where an individual is considered to not be able to make their own decisions because of mental illness, disability, or old age. The courts intervene in such cases and nominate someone, usually another person from the family, for deciding on financial matters and other major life choices for those individuals. For 13 years, Britney was in a guardianship which caused a lot of damage in her life because she was being completely controlled by her abusive father. Brittany was declared to have psychosocial disabilities, because of which the doctors and courts of California said that she was incapable of making her own decisions regarding her career, finances, family, and her own body. So I want to list out some of the main human rights violations in the Brittany case. And there is a PowerPoint also, so that all of you can follow easily. So the first one is that there was no right to making decisions for herself, no privacy, life of fear, no consent, no freedom of movement, no right to a voice, no control over her own body, people misleading her and telling her lies, people not believing her, no financial independence, not allowed to have friendships and romantic relationships, unhappiness and lack of choice in her own health. I also want to take you through how Brittany's case can be viewed through the lens of the UNCRPD and which articles are relevant in her legal case. So Article 9, accessibility. Brittany should have proper access to information. Article 13, access to justice. She should be able to hire her own lawyers. Article 14, liberty and security of person. The fact that she has a mental illness does not justify a deprivation of her liberty. Article 16, freedom from exploitation, violence and abuse. There should be proper policies in place that the abuse and harassments she faced are investigated. Article 22, respect for privacy. She should be able to change her clothes in her room with a proper door for privacy. Article 23, respect for home and the family. She should be allowed to see her children whenever she wants to and have more children if she wants to. Article 25, health. She should be given informed consent about any medical procedure on her body. Article 26, habilitation and rehabilitation. She should be able to choose her own medications and treatments. Article 29, participation in political and public life. She should be able to decide if she wants to work or when she does not want to. And so these are the basic rights protected and enshrined to us as people with disabilities in the UNCRPD, especially in relation to the bodily autonomy. So all of you might be wondering, why me, a brown, disabled and queer person living in India, resonates with someone like Brittany, a blonde, white, gorgeously sexy superstar living in the US? Well, many of these violations of rights that I listed are things I have faced at one point or another in my life as a queer person with disabilities. I feel the pain Brittany felt of being completely controlled and not having the right to express my bodily autonomy, my sexuality, or making my own decision, and people not believing in me, especially doctors, teachers, employers, parents, and others who hold power over us in society because of the social construction of ableness and disabledness. These are things that people with disabilities have to go through on a daily basis, which is why Brittany's case resonates with many people with disabilities. A lot of my queer or disabled siblings often experience a lack of autonomy and the power to choose for their own bodies. Usually, caregivers or legal guardians are the ones making important decisions for our people without our consideration or consent. One of the most difficult things that queer people with disabilities face is housing issue. Queer and trans youth are often not even safe in their own homes, within their biological families who do not understand us. People with disabilities also face similar issues where our caregivers and biological families are often abusive and do not let us move around freely, often confining us to one room of the house where no one will notice us. Trans and disabled people are segregated and separated from society, where even the government wants us to live in separate homes and neighborhoods, specifically assigned to us. This is continued institutionalization of disabled and queer people. I also want to highlight that this is all state-sponsored violations, where the governments are often complicit. This is very similar to the way India as a state has been functioning and treating marginalized bodies and identities. In the past 2 years, India has been seeing an increase in violence, Sorry, I lost my place. So in the past 2 years, India has been seeing an increase in violence and riots, which not a lot of people in the world know about because of the marketing strategies that the Indian government has devised to send out positive messages about India that are completely false. Our current government is doing a great job of masking some of the worst human rights atrocities, especially towards Muslim, Kashmiris, Dalit or lower caste folks, disabled and trans folks. The amount of policing, control, and surveillance they have acquired over our bodies and even our minds has been absolutely shocking and disorienting for us, especially during the pandemic. These are all things that are absolutely interconnected because of how much fear we live in, whether it is in a highly conflict-based environment, in a climate crisis, and in a situation of crisis, risk, and humanitarian emergencies, as described in Article 11 of the UNCRPD. People with disabilities around the world are still advocating for materials and information which is inclusive. When it comes to education, people with disabilities are often left behind because there is a set pattern and a set way of teaching and sharing knowledge which excludes our specific needs that are not accommodated for. For queer and trans youth with disabilities, there is an additional level of barrier in accessing this information, which excludes the diverse support networks we have often built for ourselves, often known as our chosen families. If we don't even have access to information, how will we be able to make decisions about our lives and our communities, especially in times of crisis and emergencies? Thus, I feel following are the necessary steps where we need support. Number one, better laws and policies that recognize and celebrate our identities, our intersections, our bodies, and our chosen families. Second, equitable and accessible resources and materials for meaningful engagement of intersectionality, marginalized youth in decision-making spaces with funds. Third, centering the experiences of youth belonging to unique marginalizations, especially in consideration of how the pandemic has left us further invisibilized and ignored. And finally, supporting and training us as various professionals, doctors, teachers, nurses, caregivers, advocates, and social workers so that we can build stronger communities. Thank you for this opportunity and this awesome space, and I look forward to engaging with all of you personally.
Thank you so much, Shivangi. That was really amazing. And yeah, we're so grateful to have you here and to hear about all of these experiences and the ways in which people can really understand each other across different divides and perspectives and share these experiences. And if, you know, even the most successful, wealthy person who has global fame and success can experience these kinds of barriers, then how many more barriers exist for people who don't have that same position of privilege to respond to them?